A mother's kiss can be the most comforting gesture known to humankind, unless that mother is Catherine de' Medici. Then it may carry the scent of clove oil and powdered arsenic. History remembers her in fragments: a queen consort, a grieving widow, pious Catholic, a Machiavellian schemer. But in truth, Catherine de' Medici was none of these and all of them at once. Beneath her widow's veil was not simply a woman nursing dynastic ambition, but a cold strategist with a heart carved from political calculus. A woman who turned seduction into surveillance, religion into weaponry, and motherhood into domination. It is tempting, comforting even, to imagine the violence of monarchs as blunt and medieval, heads rolling from axes, arrows piercing armor. But Catherine's violence was more refined. It did not scream, it whispered. Her cruelty was rarely performed on scaffolds. It unfolded in bedchambers, in secret antechambers, and in gloved hands pressing tinctures into goblets of wine. She didn't simply kill her enemies. She orchestrated their moral collapse first. She didn't behead the opposition. She made them destroy each other while she observed, quietly, from behind layers of black silk and incense smoke. And yet, perhaps most horrifying of all, is the possibility that Catherine did what she did not out of hatred, but out of love. Love for France, love for her children, love for power, a love so absolute, so possessive, so apocalyptic in its intensity, that it demanded blood as proof. This is not the story of a mad queen or a misunderstood mother. This is the story of calculated cruelty, of elegant evil, a slow-burning terror dressed in mourning lace. This is the story of how Catherine de' Medici's cruelty, measured, methodical, and merciless, knew no limits. To understand Catherine de' Medici's cruelty, one must begin not in a palace but in a plague ward. She was born in 1519 into a world already cracking with violence. Her mother, Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, died of illness within weeks of Catherine's birth. Her father, Lorenzo de' Medici, last legitimate male heir of the once glorious Florentine dynasty, died a few days later. Catherine was a Medici by blood, but an orphan by circumstance before she could even form memory. She inherited a name soaked in wealth, art, and intellect, but no hands to hold her when she cried. The Medici legacy should have protected her. Instead, it made her a pawn. Pope Clement VII, her distant uncle, claimed her as a ward of the church. But protection in the hands of popes meant something far colder. When political enemies in Florence revolted against Medici rule, the infant Catherine was hidden away in convents, moved from one sacred prison to another, barely more than a relic to be guarded. In one particularly brutal episode during the siege of Florence, rebel factions stormed the convent where she was being kept. For weeks, the young girl, barely 10, lived under threat of death or forced marriage to a mercenary commander. One rumor claimed the rebels threatened to parade her naked on the back of a donkey through the streets of Florence. They stopped short only because Catherine was, in their words, a child and a useless one. That phrase would echo throughout her life. Useless one. Too powerless to rule. Too Italian to be French. Too foreign to be trusted. These early years forged not a meek survivor but something far more dangerous. A girl who learned to make herself invisible until the moment she could not be ignored. When she was finally placed in the French court to marry Henry, second son of King Francis I, it was not out of affection, but arrangement. Her dowry, her lineage, and the Pope's favor had bought her entrance into one of Europe's most cutthroat arenas. But Catherine arrived not as a queen-in-waiting, but as a placeholder. And the message was clear: behave, produce children, stay silent. What followed was perhaps the second great wound of her life, the arrival of Diane de Poitiers. Diane was not Henry's wife, but his mistress, nearly 20 years older than him, politically savvy, and breathtakingly confident. It was Diane who held Henry's heart, Diane who controlled court access, Diane who even dictated which rooms Catherine was permitted to use. While Catherine bore the crown, Diane bore the influence. For a woman shaped by abandonment and trained in silent observation, the humiliation of powerlessness once again was unbearable. But she waited and watched. For decades, Catherine learned that power did not need to shout. It only needed to endure. And when death finally came for her husband and the throne passed to her children, Catherine de' Medici did not grieve. She took control, quietly, absolutely, and began the most terrifying chapter of her life, a mother regent ruling in blood. On July 10, 1559, King Henry II of France jousted in ceremonial armor beneath a banner of golden lions and fleur-de-lis. It was meant to be a display of royal virility, a celebration of peace after decades of war. Instead, it became a death sentence. A lance splintered in the king's eye. Not even the finest surgeons in Europe could repair what fate had already decided. 10 days later, he died screaming and delirious, and with him, the brief illusion that Catherine de' Medici was a queen only in name. She had been silent too long. Now she spoke, and when she did, even hardened courtiers learned to listen. Catherine emerged from the shadows not as a grieving widow, but as a force of unnerving composure. Her husband's mistress, Diane de Poitiers, was exiled from court within days. Catherine seized control of the royal jewels, reoccupied the most powerful chambers of the Louvre, and appointed loyalists to critical positions before Henry's corpse was even cold. Where others wept, she calculated. But what made her ascension so disturbing wasn't just the speed. It was the precision. The throne passed not to her, but to her 15-year-old son, Francis II, a sickly, malleable boy with a crown too heavy for his skull. Technically, Catherine was not queen regent, but in every meaningful sense, she now ruled France. And she ruled it as a mother whose protection was indistinguishable from control. Francis was married to Mary, Queen of Scots, a powerful Catholic ally. And so Catherine was immediately encircled by her son's illness, by Mary's political ambition, and by the scheming Guy's family, who sought to make the young king their puppet. Rather than resist this power structure outright, Catherine did something far more dangerous. She studied it, then slowly dismantled it from within. She began by removing those closest to her son. Not through open force that would have exposed her. Instead, she isolated him. Subtly, silently, letters misplaced, advisors transferred, information rerouted. The Guise brothers soon found themselves sidelined not by confrontation, but by confusion. They weren't expelled. They were replaced before they realized they'd lost control. When Francis II died just a year into his reign, some whispered it was natural, others whispered more darkly. Catherine found herself once again near the center of a crisis. Now her 10-year-old son Charles IX would become king. And with him, Catherine would officially step into the role she had always rehearsed in silence. Queen Regent of France. To the outside world, she was a grieving mother thrust into political chaos. But those who looked closer saw something else. The court, once ruled by male factions of nobility and lineage, was now structured around a woman in black. A woman who had survived abandonment, humiliation, and betrayal, and who had learned, better than anyone, how to rule without ever being seen doing it. Catherine wasn't just seizing power, she was redefining it. And the cost of that redefinition would soon be paid in blood, rivers of it. On August 18, 1572, Paris glowed with banners, silk, and bells. A royal wedding was to be held, one meant to unite a fractured nation. Catherine de' Medici's daughter, Marguerite de Valois, would marry Henry of Navarre, a Protestant. The union was presented as a gesture of healing between Catholics and Huguenots after decades of civil war. But beneath the lace, satin, and carefully crafted smiles, a dagger was being sharpened. The city was a powder keg, and Catherine was holding the match. To the casual observer, the ceremony appeared joyous. Protestants and Catholics mingled in uneasy celebration. Foreign diplomats toasted. Dancers spun in the Louvre's golden halls. But those familiar with Catherine's strategies saw the signs. The sudden presence of extra Swiss guards, the strategic housing of Huguenot leaders within close range of the palace, the deliberate bottlenecking of escape routes through Paris' narrow streets. It wasn't a wedding, it was a trap. Just 6 days after the vows were exchanged, on the night of August 23rd, the killing began. At Catherine's direction, though her personal hand would never appear in any formal document, the bell of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois rang out across the city at midnight. It was not a call to prayer. It was a signal. The first blade struck Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, one of the highest-ranking Protestant leaders and a guest of the crown. He had survived an earlier assassination attempt days prior, a failed gunshot. But Catherine had made sure he remained in his rooms, injured, confined. When the assassins entered, Coligny's body was defenestrated, thrown from the window, butchered in the street below, and left for the mob. Then Paris erupted. The violence that followed was not spontaneous. It was methodical. Protestant nobles, generals, and clergy had all been invited to the city for the wedding. Now they were executed with chilling efficiency. Soldiers kicked down doors, stabbed men in their beds, slit the throats of women and children. In the Seine, bodies bobbed like driftwood. In alleyways, the cobblestones turned black with blood and bone. The massacre didn't last a day. It lasted a week. And Catherine? She remained composed. When word reached her that the streets were clogged with corpses, she allegedly replied, "Better that than rebellion." She understood something the rest of Europe struggled to grasp. Violence wasn't just suppression. It was communication. The slaughter was a message, not just to Protestants, but to anyone who believed that royal tolerance would ever outweigh royal control. Historians would later argue about Catherine's direct involvement. Did she order the killings? Did she merely allow them? Was she manipulated by the Guise faction, or did she orchestrate every death like a composer arranging a requiem? The truth lies somewhere between all those lines, blurred intentionally by Catherine herself. What is clear is this: the massacre was too efficient to be spontaneous. Guards were issued lists of targets. Catholic homes were marked with white crosses. Protestant homes were left exposed. This was a cartography of murder planned in advance. And only someone with Catherine's reach could have drawn the map. Her daughter, Marguerite, the bride, later wrote in her memoirs that she awoke to find a Protestant man hiding in her bedchamber, bloodied, trembling, having fled execution. She begged for his life. Catherine refused. "This is no longer your wedding week," she is said to have whispered. "It is a holy cleansing." But the cleansing did not wash away the sin. It only sank deeper into the soil of France. Estimates vary, but between 5,000 and 30,000 people were killed across France in the wake of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. In Paris, the stench of rotting bodies lingered in alleyways for months. Catherine's enemies declared her a butcher. Her allies called her a savior of Catholicism. But both sides agreed on one thing: nothing like this had ever happened in France before, and nothing would ever be the same again. It wasn't just a massacre. It was a performance, the kind of performance Catherine had perfected. The bells, the blood, the brides, and in the center, a mother regent, cloaked in black, watching her enemies fall, not with glee, but with the serene satisfaction of a woman who had once been helpless and who now held life and death in her gloved hands. Not all of Catherine de Medici's cruelty wore armor or carried swords. Some of it wore pearls, smiled sweetly, listened, laughed, and then destroyed. While the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day was brutal and unmistakably public, Catherine's most effective weapons often moved through shadows. She understood, perhaps more than any monarch of her time, that psychological warfare didn't require blood, only suggestion. A raised eyebrow, a misplaced letter, a glance held too long at the wrong moment. These were the tools she used to corrode reputations and unravel alliances. Her most infamous creation in this regard was a collection of women known as l'Escadron Volant, the Flying Squadron. The name sounds almost romantic, but its purpose was surgical. These were not mere courtesans. They were carefully selected, intelligent, beautiful, trained in rhetoric and seduction. Catherine hand-picked them not to please kings or flatter nobles, but to infiltrate. Their orders were simple and chilling. Get close, observe everything, and report back. And if necessary, influence decisions from within the bedchamber. The Flying Squadron was Catherine's living intelligence network. They whispered into ears at midnight, reclined in laps during council sessions, and feigned intimacy to unearth secrets. There were no safe spaces in her court, no private moments, only mirrors, masks, and watchers. But even this human surveillance system paled in comparison to Catherine's other obsession: poison. Rumors swirled for centuries that Catherine kept a private cabinet of toxins, many imported from Italy, the land of her birth, and of the infamous Borgia legacy. She was said to work with apothecaries, particularly the darkly gifted Cosimo Ruggieri, who provided both potions and premonitions. Ruggieri was no mere healer. He was an alchemist, astrologer, and, some claimed, a necromancer. Together, Catherine and her circle blurred the lines between medicine, mysticism, and murder. The most feared item in her arsenal was the Book of Poisons, a manual reportedly passed down from Italian nobles. A catalog of death hidden in perfumes, gloves, inks, and wine. Death not by blade, but by time. Some concoctions killed in hours, others in weeks. All left little trace. Enemies of the crown grew ill mysteriously. Skin turned black, tongues swelled, minds unraveled, and no one could ever prove it was Catherine. Because that was the point. Fear was most effective when it couldn't be traced. Even loyal nobles weren't spared. Catherine understood the value of controlled paranoia, kept ambition in check. Letters were opened. Servants disappeared. A courtier might sip wine one evening, wake the next with shaking hands and stomach convulsions, only to recover fully, never knowing whether it had been poison or imagination. But the fear would remain, and fear, Catherine knew, could rule more effectively than law. One of her favorite tactics was to feed disinformation to two rival courtiers and watch which one used it, thereby identifying the traitor without lifting a finger. Betrayals became self-revealing. It was cruelty without contact, control without confrontation. Perhaps most chilling of all was her ability to use kindness as cruelty. She would offer forgiveness where it wasn't deserved, favor to those who had wronged her, gifts to those she planned to ruin. Her mercy was a mask. One never knew whether they were being embraced or poisoned. Even her own children were not exempt. Her son Charles IX, haunted by the guilt of Saint Bartholomew's massacre, began wasting away soon after. He suffered fits of rage, hallucinations, vomiting. Physicians described his condition as melancholia that bleeds. Modern scholars suggest he may have had tuberculosis or even undiagnosed schizophrenia, but some believe his decline was accelerated by slow poison. Catherine, always at his bedside, played the grieving mother, even as rumors whispered that she was shortening his suffering or silencing his secrets. And when he died, Henry III rose. Another son, another puppet. Catherine's court had become a stage of constant performance, where no one, not a friend, not a brother, not even a child, was safe from the Queen's invisible hand, where smiling lips could hide deadly intentions, where a single misplaced word could end a life, and where the true horror wasn't in what was seen, but in what could never be proven. A mother's love is supposed to protect, to nurture, to preserve. But in the court of Catherine de' Medici, love was a knife, not wielded in fury, but in strategy. For her, motherhood was not sacred. It was political, and no one suffered under that banner more than her own children. She had 10 of them. Only 3 sons would live to rule. None would survive her in spirit. Her first ruling son, Francis II, was too weak to resist her, too frail to govern. He died before she could fully shape him. But Charles IX, the second, became her first complete creation and her first true casualty. Charles was crowned at the age of 10. From the beginning, he was hemmed in by his mother's control. Every advisor appointed by her, every decision filtered through her whispered counsel. To the public, she was a mother regent. In reality, she was a puppeteer whose strings were invisible but unbreakable. Charles's personality, once vivacious and curious, soon dissolved under the weight of Catherine's manipulation. She encouraged him to write poetry and hunt, distractions from governance. She fed him conflicting information, isolating him from his nobles, ensuring his only loyalty was to her. And when it came time to order the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, she didn't command him. She guided him, letting him believe the decision was his, while ensuring he had no alternatives. The massacre destroyed Charles more than any enemy ever could. Witnesses described him in the weeks that followed as pale, sweating, sickened by the screams he claimed to still hear in his sleep. He wept uncontrollably, once bursting into tears in front of the royal council. His body deteriorated rapidly, his mind even faster. He began vomiting blood. His skin turned gray. He accused his own food of being poisoned. He distrusted even the air in his chambers. He wrote desperate letters to Protestant leaders begging forgiveness, letters Catherine intercepted and destroyed. Some historians believe his decline was simply tuberculosis. Others suspect that Catherine herself administered slow poison, not out of hatred but mercy, or, more disturbingly, to prevent him from undoing what she had so carefully constructed. Whether or not she killed him physically, she certainly killed him psychologically. He died at the age of 23, whispering, "I am lost, I am damned," into the darkness. Then came Henry III, Catherine's favorite, her last hope, the son she dressed in silk and molded with iron will. He was clever, elegant, and utterly dominated by her presence. But her influence came at a cost. Henry's rule was marked by chaos, not because of incompetence, but because he had never learned to think without her. He surrounded himself with mignons, handsome favorites who alienated the nobility and shocked the Catholic League. Catherine tried to rein him in, but by then, her control had become so absolute that it backfired. Henry yearned for independence but lacked the psychological tools to claim it. He rebelled in shallow ways, through fashion, flirtation, and whispers of scandal, but every major decision still led back to his mother's cold counsel. As civil war ignited again in France, Catherine begged him to make peace. But her past had finally caught up with her. The very tools she used to preserve the crown, poison, seduction, misinformation, had made the monarchy toxic. No one trusted the queen, and by extension, no one trusted her son. Eventually, Henry would be assassinated. Alone, unloved. His bloodline ended with him, a final punctuation mark on the dynasty Catherine had spent her life trying to save. But she hadn't saved it. She had strangled it slowly with silk gloves. Even her daughters were not spared. Marguerite, the bride at the bloody wedding, was manipulated, discarded, and eventually imprisoned by her own brother. After years of surviving a marriage arranged not for love but as a trap. In her memoirs, she never accused Catherine outright. But the silence around her mother was deafening. Catherine outlived almost all of her children. By the time she died in 1589, she was alone, surrounded not by heirs, but by ghosts. Her palace, once filled with the noise of strategy and courtly gossip, had grown quiet. The portraits of her sons hung like accusations, and her legacy, once crafted so carefully, had begun to rot before she was even in the grave. It is said that a mother's love is unconditional, but Catherine's love had conditions: obedience, control, loyalty unto death. Anything less was betrayal. And for Catherine de' Medici, betrayal was never forgiven, even from her own blood.